Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan, head of BlueStack Productions, the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. I'm pleased today to be here in Maynooth for another of our conversations on environmental matters with Professor John Sweeney from National University of Ireland in Maynooth. John, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Now, John is a professor of geography at Maynooth. He's director of the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Unit, which is a very important climate study group here in Maynooth and in Ireland. He has been a participant in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, both as a review editor and as a contributing writer over the years. And he's also president of Antashka. And so we're very happy he's going to give us some time to talk to us today, particularly about the Irish Climate Bill, which has just been published, at least the heads of it.
Yeah.
Now, John, would you explain to the audience, this is a draft bill, and they call it the heads of the bill. What does that mean in terms of the future development of this legislation?
Well, the bill, as published, is simply enabling legislation which contains the sort of outline of what is being proposed. After this stage, it will go through various committees, and in those stages, one hopes that more in the way of specifics will be inserted into the bill. So this is a bill which has emerged after quite a long gestation period. It was part of the commitment given by the government parties in their election manifestos, and this time last year the Minister for the Environment indicated that he would be deferring bringing forward the heads of a climate bill for up to a year pending a report on what we should have in such a bill from the National Economic and Social Council. So we've had a hiatus of about a year while that report has been prepared, and what has now emerged is a bill which is a very short bill outlining the general thrust of climate change policy and how that will be implemented over the next few years.
Now, John, is there a public consultation as part of this development of the details of the bill over the next year or so?
There was, first of all, a public consultation prior to the publication of the heads of the bill. I think around 600 individuals and organisations made submissions to the Department of the Environment as to what they would like to see in such a bill. Whether those have been taken on board in terms of the final bill is perhaps open to question, but I don't think that the heads of bill now will go out for public consultation. It will simply go through the internal Oireachtas committees. It will go through the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the Environment, for example, and there will be various proposals put in the various stages of the Dáil over that. But the time for consultation, I think, has passed at this point.
Now, one of the two issues that was certainly of concern to the environmental community in Ireland, many others, was the issue of targets in the bill and the issue of an independent advisory committee advising them. With regard to the targets, there are no targets in this bill, correct? And were there, in the earlier bills, the private bills and the other bills, were there targets included in those bills as they were being proposed?
There were, and there were targets which were designed primarily to meet our EU obligation of a reduction of 20% by the year 2020. But there were also longer term targets which the developed countries of the world have generally agreed to as being necessary to ensure that we have a chance of avoiding the dangerous climate threshold of a 2 degree of warming. And the IPCC and the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, people have recommended that for developed countries we require to see a reduction of the order of 80% by 2050 from the developed countries, and 25 to 40% from for the year 2020. And this is to allow, of course, the developing countries to adopt a reasonable trajectory for their own development to ensure their living standards can be brought up without undue burdens being placed upon them. So the G8, for example, have agreed to that 80% reduction target for their developed economies, and the United Kingdom has enshrined that in its climate bill with a very specific sets of targets for achieving that. There is no indication in the heads of the bill that we've seen so far that will be part and parcel of the Irish legislation. There are general phrases of aspirations towards decarbonisation and low carbon development, but there is no specific commitment to a target, for example, for 2030 or 2050. And for many people, this is the major problem with this particular piece of legislation, because it doesn't give the various sectors which contribute to carbon emissions any clarity as regards what will be required of them in the years ahead. And when investment decisions are being made by industry, what they do like is some kind of certainty as to what kind of rules they will be bound by in the future. And this absence of clarity is one of the major drawbacks of the current bill. For example, what is to be the burden imposed on transport? What is to be the burden imposed on the cement industry? What is to be the burden imposed on general commercial activity and residential emitters of CO2 vis-a-vis, for example, the agricultural sector? We don't have any clarity on this, and without some sort of national consensus and national debate, then it means that getting from A to B is going to be very difficult, and it becomes, unfortunately, the law of the jungle, those who can shout loudest and those who are most powerful, rather than a reasoned allocation of dividing the national emissions cake, which is what we're really talking about in climate change, dividing up a fixed amount among society in some kind of equitable way. And in the absence of that, of course, we're liable to see a sort of a laissez-faire approach developing, and that's going to be the problem, I think, in terms of getting the desired reductions in the Irish economy. The bill simply says that we'll do what we're forced to do, and we'll do anything extra that we're forced to do, but we will not give you a figure for anything beyond that at this stage. And it contrasts very much with the first national climate change policy, which emerged about a decade or so ago, where each sector in the Irish economy was examined, and the potential for reductions were laid out, so that we had, for example, energy production, energy emissions being sort of said, well, okay, you can achieve this %, agriculture, you can achieve this %. And it gave clarity to those sectors, because then you could plan for building new power stations with particular fuel mixes. You could plan for particular levels of insulation in the construction industry, for changing the legislation for materials that might be used, and so on. That kind of thing is very useful and very important. A number of the leading companies in Ireland who are represented in business in the community have been quite critical of the bill for not giving that kind of clarity that they require. And we're talking about big employers like Vodafone, like Siemens, and so on. These are people who will be investing in Ireland in the future, and may well be saying to themselves at this stage, well, in this current state of uncertainty, I don't know where I'm going to put my money, but how am I going to cope if 90% of the emissions, for example, in 2050 are going to one sector like agriculture, and I'm going to be forced to decarbonise at great cost? So those kinds of decisions are being made at the moment.
There's also concern and calls by the environmental community for independent expert advisory board, as there exists in the UK, and that doesn't appear here. It's a government advisory board. What's your read on that?
Well, I think
as proposed in the heads of the...
Yeah, I mean the UK Committee on Climate Change is a very powerful body, and it has to be a very powerful body, because this is a problem where you have to bang heads together from different departments, and in particular having an advisory committee which is located in one department on its own, reporting to one department on its own, doesn't give you the kind of clout that's necessary, because what we really need here is responsibility to be shared for action in agriculture, in industry, in energy, in environment. And those are very powerful public bodies with very powerful civil service infrastructure associated with them. And unless you have a capability of going in and making sort of people talk to each other and breaking down the silos between those big departments, then you end up with a very sort of neutered kind of advisory body. And I think what's being envisaged here is something which will be subservient to the minister, rather than something which would be capable of giving guidance beyond simply sort of a rubber stamp to what's being done by one particular department.
The report that we're talking about, the NESC, which is the National Economic and Social Council of Ireland, which produced a report called Ireland and the Climate Change Challenge, connecting how much with how to, certainly seems to purports to provide the intellectual or conceptual underpinnings to the approach taken in the bill. One of the interesting things at the beginning of the report, as acknowledged by the head of it, is that this was an unusual procedure, because typically the government asked the NESC Council to produce a report. In this case, it was only the, quote, Secretariat that was asked to produce the report, and that the council was not involved in it. And what's your understanding of that procedure and why? I
think it's an unfortunate way that this was set up. I think it's quite clear that the report proved very politically expedient for the publication of the heads of bill. In fact, they were published simultaneously. The idea of only using the Secretariat, I suppose, enabled the terms of reference to be defined in a much more narrow way. And while I have every respect for the individuals involved in producing the report, I think that their report is very limited in terms of its ability to see beyond fairly narrow economic paradigms in terms of handling climate change. The idea of only using the Secretariat, of course, did exclude the general NESC Council, which has representatives of many Irish sectors who would have an interest in climate change, such as the industry sector, such as the agriculture sector, such as the environmental NGO sector. It excluded them from substantial inputs to that report, and while consultation and the ultimate showing of that report to the overall NESC Council undoubtedly occurred, I think the involvement of those other wider sectoral interests was fairly minimal, and to me, I think it was quite regrettable. But it certainly did serve a very politically expedient purpose at the end of the day, shall we say.
The NESC was directed by the minister to produce a report as a move beyond a compliance-centric approach. What is your understanding of what they mean by a compliance-centric approach?
It's a weasel words, really, I think, when you look at it, because compliance-centric, beyond a compliance-centric approach means, first of all, that you have reached the stage of compliance. And that, to me, is the first hurdle in all of this, because we certainly haven't reached the stage of compliance, so I don't think there's much point in charting a road ahead from somewhere we haven't got to yet. So I think I can see where the report is trying to take a rather more superior view of the problem, but I think it's failing to come to grips with the practicalities of the fact that getting to that first stage of compliance is the key issue, not getting beyond it. And that's proven to be, over the past decade, the big problem for Ireland, is simply getting that first stage of compliance achieved. So yes, it's very nice language, and yes, academically it makes a lot of sense, but in practical terms, I think it ignores the huge obstacles that are really there in terms of getting to a point where we can have that vision beyond compliance. We have a long tradition in Ireland of using a very sort of permissive language in our legislation, for example. The bill that we have been presented with, I think, has the word "have regard to" 22 times in it.
Yes.
And the courts have already interpreted that phrase. It's a phrase that I recall very vividly from about 10 years ago, when there was a lot of concern about the applicability of regional planning guidelines to local authority development plans. And this phrase was in fact tested in the High Court. And Justice Quirk at the time said really well, what this means is that the local authorities open the book, look at it, close the book again, and get on with business. And that was in effect really what the phrase meant in legal terms. So again, it's cropping up so much in this bill that it's quite likely that people will be able to drive a cart and horse through many aspects of it when it becomes a more crystallized version, unfortunately. And I think the report is it makes a good point here that, you know, the international process has not delivered. I think that's a very fair comment, but that's not justification for a national effort not being made either. Ireland, for example, I think has a per capita greenhouse gas emission which places us in the top dozen or so countries in the world. So in terms of culpability for the damage being done by climate change in developing countries, but even here in Ireland, we have more than most, I think, responsibility. And I think it's incumbent on us, therefore, not to simply say we will do the minimum in terms of tackling the problem, but rather that we are prepared to illustrate that Ireland as a country is willing to shoulder its international obligations as well as any other country.
As you get into the report, you begin to see the agriculture driving the climate policy throughout this report. How is it doing that, and how is that going to be a problem for Ireland?
Well, I think we've seen over the course of all of the three climate bills and more so far, how good intentions tend to be unpicked as they proceed. And they tend to be unpicked largely because very powerful vested interest groups lobby effectively for that dilution to take place. And, you know, there is no more effective lobby group, I think, in Ireland than the agricultural lobby group. It's a very important body. We are a country which has a unique carbon dioxide, a unique greenhouse gas emissions profile, ourselves and New Zealand. And I think there is a genuine wish among all Irish people that we don't want to prejudice the future of our food production systems. But at the same time, I think we have to recognise that all aspects of society have to bear some sort of share of the burden of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In agriculture, it's more difficult, I have to say, than most other sectors, but there are very many ways in which a reduction can take place through feeding mixes, through grazing mixtures, through pasture management and so on. Now, those kinds of things can achieve considerable improvements, but of course we have as well with the reduction of, or the removal of the milk levy in 2014 or 15, we have the likelihood that Ireland's competitive advantage in livestock will be realised by having the possibility of increasing meat and milk production hugely. And this is the underpinning of the Harvest 2020 proposal, where we're looking at 50% increases in dairy cattle. We're looking at substantial increases in other sectors of society, all of which, of course, will entail higher greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea that Ireland therefore will start to feed large sections of the world through this increase in food, I think, has permeated the psyche of our decision makers to the extent that protecting the agricultural sector at all costs has become a paramount concern. No, I think it's important that we do protect our agricultural sector, but I think we do have to have a debate about to what extent our emissions in 2050 will be 90% agricultural, for example, and 10% for the rest of our activities in Ireland, because we are looking at I don't know, maybe have we 250,000 farmers, but we certainly have a lot more people in residential categories, a lot more in industrial employment, a lot more in the energy industry and so on. So we have to have a debate about this, and we have to recognise what is feasible and what is not feasible. And that's where I think the lobby is at the moment very, very powerful in terms of the agricultural sector. It's not being matched by, for example, people who drive cars. It's not being matched by people who live in houses burning gas or oil. And I think the balance between those sectors really is the problem. Those voices are not being heard, but the voices of a very powerful agricultural lobby are being heard.
That figure you use of 90% of emissions in 2050 will be coming from agriculture is from the EPA. That's
yes. Well, this is the projections from the SMILE model that has been run by academics under the auspices of the EPA, and this would appear to be where a laissez-faire approach at the moment is taking us, and the climate change bill will certainly not be something that will change direction in that case.
There's no focus on methane, and the word is used once in the report, as I did a search. And indeed, even Harvest 2020 you talked about is discussed in passing with about 2 paragraphs in the whole report. So there's this avoidance of confronting that very issue that I think you're right. We need a discussion about that.
Well, methane is, as a radiation forcing gas, 21 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, but it also lingers a lot less in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. It comes out of the atmosphere quicker. So in many respects, the quickest fix for climate will come from tackling directly methane rather than tackling directly CO2. So it's something that we should be considering, as we should also from the nitrous oxides as well, because they are again agriculturally related. So the denitrification of fertilizer associated with intensification of agriculture is going to be a major problem for Harvest 2020. The ability to comply with the Framework Water Directive is going to be a problem. The ability to comply with the Nitrate Directive is going to be a problem. These are issues which need to be teased out in the context of climate change issues as well, and they haven't really been brought to the surface as openly as I think they should. Methane, of course, will also be a problem with, for example, any fracking that we undertake in Ireland as well, which we have to think a little about too, how we count the fugitive emissions that will occur in that situation. So it is an issue which I think is very important, and it will bubble up quite strongly in the future.
John, I think you're right. We need a conversation, and I think you've started the terms of the conversation, and thanks for talking with us today.